The rain started the moment we crossed the state line. It wasn't the gentle kind of rain that lulls you to sleep, but a relentless pounding downpour that made the windshield wipers groan in protest. The kind of rain that feels like it's chasing you. I glanced at my husband, Daniel, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. He hadn't said a word in over an hour. "Maybe we should stop for the night," I suggested, my voice barely audible over the storm. The GPS had lost signal miles back, and the winding mountain road seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain, and the trees loomed like shadowy sentinels on either side of us. Daniel didn't respond. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road. I couldn't tell if he was angry or just focused. He'd been like this since we left the wedding reception. Distant, almost cold. I told myself it was just the stress of the wedding, the exhaustion of planning and pleasing everyone. But now, alone in the car with him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Daniel?" I tried again, louder this time. "We're almost there," he said curtly, his tone leaving no room for argument. I bit my lip and turned to stare out the window. The rain blurred the glass, turning the world outside into a smeared, indistinct nightmare. When we finally pulled into the driveway of the cabin, I felt a flicker of relief. The place was smaller than I'd imagined, nestled deep in the woods with no other houses in sight. It was quaint, in a rustic sort of way, with a steeply pitched roof and a chimney that jutted into the stormy sky. But as I stepped out of the car, the wind howling around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was watching us. Daniel grabbed our bags from the trunk and headed for the door without a word. I followed, my heels sinking into the muddy ground. The key was under the mat, just as the rental listing had promised. Daniel unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. Daniel flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. "Power's out," he muttered, pulling out his phone to use the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, illuminating a worn couch, a dusty fireplace, and a small kitchenette. It was cozy in a way, but the shadows seemed to press in on us, making the space feel smaller than it was. "I'll start a fire," Daniel said, setting down the bags and heading for the fireplace. I stood in the middle of the room, hugging myself against the chill. The rain hammered against the roof, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, but it clung to me like a second skin. Daniel managed to get the fire going, and the flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows across the room. He sat down on the couch, staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. I sat beside him, close but not touching. The silence between us was heavy, suffocating. "Are you okay?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. "You've been so quiet." He didn't look at me. "I'm fine," he said, his tone flat. "Just tired." I wanted to believe him, but something in his voice made my stomach twist. I opened my mouth to say more, but a loud thud from upstairs cut me off. My heart leapt into my throat, and I grabbed Daniel's arm. "What was that?" He didn't seem fazed. "Probably just the wind," he said, shrugging off my hand. "This place is old. It creaks." I nodded, trying to convince myself he was right, but the sound had been too sharp, too deliberate to be just the wind. I glanced at the staircase, the darkness at the top seeming to pulse like a living thing. My imagination ran wild, conjuring images of intruders, wild animals, or worse. "Let's go to bed," Daniel said suddenly, standing up. "We'll figure everything out in the morning." I followed him upstairs, the wooden steps groaning under our weight. The bedroom was small, with a sagging double bed and a single window that rattled in the wind. Daniel climbed into bed without a word, his back to me. I lay down beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm outside and the creaks and groans of the cabin. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound made me jump, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of Daniel's voice. "Emily," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Wake up." I opened my eyes, disoriented. The fire had died down, leaving the room in near total darkness. "What is it?" I mumbled, my heart already racing. "I heard something," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Outside." I sat up, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. Then, faintly, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. "What is that?" I whispered, clutching the blanket to my chest. Daniel didn't answer. He got out of bed and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. I wanted to tell him to come back, to stay away from the window, but the words caught in my throat. The growl came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the cabin. The growl echoed through the cabin, low and menacing, sending a jolt of panic through me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes locked on Daniel as he stood by the window. His silhouette was stark against the faint glow of the dying fire, his shoulders tense. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What is that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned away from the window and walked toward the bedroom door, his movements slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him, my mind racing. What was he doing? Why wasn't he saying anything? "Daniel, wait," I started, but he was already out the door, his footsteps creaking down the hallway. I sat there for a moment, paralyzed by fear, before forcing myself to move. I couldn't stay here alone. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and followed him, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The hallway was pitch black, the beam of the flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. I could hear Daniel's footsteps ahead of me, but I couldn't see him. The growl came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from the living room. My stomach churned as I crept down the stairs, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the bottom, I saw Daniel standing in the middle of the room, staring at the front door. It was slightly ajar, the wind howling through the crack. Rain splattered against the floor, and the cold air made me shiver. But what made my blood run cold was the sound. The growl was unmistakable now, deep and guttural, coming from just outside the door. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to close the door. Lock it." He didn't move. He just stood there, his back to me, his shoulders rigid. I took a step closer, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. "Daniel, please." Before I could finish, the door flew open with a crash, slamming against the wall. The growl turned into a snarl, and I caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. A shadow, low to the ground, its eyes glinting in the flashlight's beam. I screamed and stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild, spinning shadows around the room. "Daniel," I shouted, my voice breaking. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the open door as the shadow crept closer. I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. The shadow retreated into the night, and the cabin was silent except for the sound of the rain. I stood there, trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Daniel finally turned to look at me, his face expressionless. "It's gone," he said simply, as if nothing had happened. I stared at him, my mind reeling. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What the hell is going on, Daniel?" He didn't answer. He just walked over to the door and closed it, locking it with a firm click. Then he turned and headed back upstairs, leaving me standing there in the dark. The next morning, I woke up alone. The storm had passed, and sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting a warm glow over the room. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that last night had been a dream, a product of exhaustion and stress. But the memory of the growl, the shadow, and Daniel's strange behavior was too vivid to dismiss. I got out of bed and went downstairs, half expecting to find Daniel in the kitchen making coffee like nothing had happened. But the cabin was empty. The front door was still locked, and there was no sign of him. My stomach twisted with unease as I searched the cabin, calling his name. No answer. I stepped outside, the morning air crisp and cool. The ground was muddy from the rain, and I could see tire tracks leading away from the cabin. Daniel's car was gone. My heart sank as I realized he'd left me here alone. I went back inside and tried to call him, but there was no signal. The cabin felt even more oppressive now, the silence heavy and suffocating. I tried to distract myself by tidying up, but every creak and groan of the old building made me jump. My mind kept replaying the events of last night. The growl, the shadow, Daniel's cold detachment. None of it made sense. As the day wore on, my anxiety grew. I tried to convince myself that Daniel had just gone into town for supplies, that he'd be back soon. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The cabin felt like a trap, the walls closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to explore the woods, hoping to find a road or a neighbor who could help me. I grabbed a jacket and a pair of boots from the closet and headed outside. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was soft and wet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I hadn't gone far when I found it, a small clearing with a single tree in the center. Hanging from one of the branches was a rope, frayed and weathered, tied into a noose. My stomach turned as I stared at it, a cold dread settling over me. What was this? Some kind of sick joke? I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a glint of metal on the ground near the base of the tree. I knelt down and brushed away the leaves, revealing a small rusted locket. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, her eyes wide and fearful. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the photo. There was something familiar about her, something I couldn't quite place. I closed the locket and slipped it into my pocket, my mind racing. What was going on here? What had Daniel gotten us into? I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding. As I approached the front door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, weathered sign nailed to the side of the building. The paint was peeling, but I could still make out the words. Property of the Blackwood Estate. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Blackwood Estate. The name sent a chill down my spine. I'd never heard of it before, but something about it felt wrong. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, my mind spinning with questions. Who was the woman in the locket? What had happened here? And where the hell was Daniel? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump, and the shadows in the cabin seemed to shift and move on their own. I sat by the fireplace, clutching the locket, my mind racing. The growl from last night, the noose in the woods, the photograph, it all felt connected, but I couldn't piece it together. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, a faint scratching at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I stood up, my eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then I heard it, a voice, faint and muffled. "Emily, let me in." It was Daniel. I rushed to the door and threw it open, relief flooding through me. But the relief turned to horror as I saw him. He was covered in mud, his clothes torn, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wild, unfocused, and he was clutching something in his hand, a bloody knife. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What happened?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes empty, and then he pushed past me into the cabin. I followed him, my mind reeling. He went straight to the fireplace and dropped the knife into the flames, watching as it burned. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We need to leave," he said, his voice hollow. "Now." "What's going on?" I demanded, my fear giving way to anger. "Where have you been? What is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. I struggled against him, but his grip was like iron. "Daniel, stop, you're hurting me." He let go of me suddenly, his face twisting in pain. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to hurt you." "Do what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with tears. "You don't remember, do you?" "Remember what?" He took a step closer, his hands trembling. "Emily, you died 5 years ago. In this cabin." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process what he was saying. "What are you talking about? That's not possible." "It's true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were sick. We came here to get away, to spend your last days together. But you didn't make it. I couldn't let you go. I couldn't." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, this isn't real. You're lying." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, handing it to me. It was a picture of us, standing in front of the cabin, smiling. But something was wrong. The woman in the photo wasn't me. It was the woman from the locket. "I tried to bring you back," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I did things, terrible things. But it didn't work. You're not her. You're not Emily." I dropped the photograph, my hands trembling. "Who am I?" I whispered. He looked at me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't know.